Good morning. You notice I'm back. I didn't run away during the week. We are slowly, we survived our first full week here, and we're slowly finding our way around and getting to know things. If you look at me and you say, do you know what you're doing? Just assume I don't and help me out. I'd appreciate that. There's a few things that really encourages me on Sunday. One of them is just seeing you here. You do not know how much you encourage me when you attend and you're here and you're smiling and just being a part of worshiping God. The other thing that excites me and just gets me ready to preach is when I hear singing. And I was really encouraged. I really enjoyed your song selection, by the way, this morning.
My voice enjoyed it.
Your voice did just fine. Don't worry about that. But it was. I really enjoyed it this morning. I like to point that out. That I thought it was really good today. Before we get started, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we come this morning. We thank you so much that we can be here among family. Thank you for making us a family. Thank you so much for your Son, Jesus. Father, be with us today as we open your word and we spend a little bit of time studying it. May Jesus be lifted up this morning. May we grow closer to him, and as we grow closer to him, let us grow closer to one another. Thank you just so much how you've loved us, how you provided for us, and how you saved us. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Amen. You didn't realize this, but when I came in December and interviewed, I pulled a fast one on you. I started a series, and I did that so you'd have to have me back to finish the series. See, I'm sneaky. It was the first lesson in a 3-part series I did on discipleship, looking at the life of Peter. And remember last time we looked at how Jesus interrupted Peter and how he was blessed by that interruption. Well, we want to look at Peter's life, an incident in his life again, that I think demonstrates his discipleship to Jesus. I opened my last sermon, talking about a German theologian by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Some of you probably know the name. He was a theologian that lived during the rise of Nazi Germany and through World War II. He was a critic of Hitler and the Nazi Party. He refused to sign the loyalty oath the Nazi Party demanded that clergy sign back then. He spent the last 2 years of his life, of the war, in a German concentration camp. And just a few weeks before the war ended, Hitler signed his death warrant. And early in the morning, they stripped him naked, marched him out into the compound, and hung him. Just about a week before his camp was liberated by the Americans. He wrote several books in his short life, and his most famous is one called The Cost of Discipleship. If you've not read it, I recommend that you read that book. I want to read a quote from that book today. He wrote, "Discipleship is not limited to what you can comprehend. It transcends all comprehension. Plunge into the deep water beyond our own comprehension, and He, God, will help you comprehend even as He does." I believe what Dietrich Bonhoeffer is trying to tell us is that when you follow God, be prepared to be amazed. And Jesus amazed his disciples. And on one day, he even challenged Peter's understanding of reality. It's found in Matthew chapter 14. And if you would, turn there, please. We're going to start about verse 22. Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside to pray by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" And when they had climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." What a day Peter had. It started early that morning. They were out in the wilderness. And people came from everywhere to see Jesus, to hear him teach, to have miracles performed. And Jesus did not disappoint them. He spent the day teaching. He healed some of them during the day up until late in the afternoon. And it was time for the people to disperse and go home. The problem is they were out in the wilderness. And many of them came for miles that day to hear Jesus. And Jesus told his disciples, "I don't want to send them away hungry. We're going to feed them." You see, there was no McDonald's or Denny's. There wasn't even a Burger King or Wendy's to be seen anywhere. The problem is, there was they estimate there's about 15,000 people there. The text says 5,000 men. And experts say about 15,000 when you add in the women and children. And the apostles came to him and said, "Lord, we don't have enough. All we have with us is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Jesus said, "That's not a problem." And he blessed it. And he broke it into pieces. And they fed everybody that day on 5 loaves and 2 fish. In fact, when it was all over with, the disciples picked up the scraps. And they had enough for themselves and leftovers for several days. They said they picked up 12 basketfuls of food. And then they dismissed the crowd, and Jesus told the disciples, "I want you to go on across the lake. I'll join you later." He needed some time alone. He needed to spend some time with his Father. And so they got into the boat, but the going was tough. Because it said the wind and the waves was against them. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, they were still only halfway across the lake. And the waves were up and the wind was blowing, and they looked out among the waves and they saw it. They saw what looked like a ghost walking towards them. But as they got closer, they realized it wasn't a ghost. It was their Lord coming to them. Can you imagine the bewilderment among the disciples? And Jesus cried out, "Do not be afraid, it is I." Then Peter, the impulsive one, asked to come out to him. He asked to get out of the boat and come to Jesus, not swimming, but walking on the water. I can't even imagine that. And then Peter stepped out of the boat onto the waves. I've always wondered this, if the disciples in the boat tried to stop him at the last minute. "No, Peter, don't!" They grabbed for him and missed as he stepped out of the boat. I was on a mission committee with the church I attended when we lived in Denver. I wasn't a minister back then. I was an insurance adjuster. Please don't boo. It was not much of a committee because, see, we didn't support any mission works. We were a new committee, and we were formed to look into the possibility of planting a church in Russia. This is right after the Iron Curtain had fallen, and Russia was open to evangelism. And one of our ministers had been invited to go and spend 2 months in Russia preaching for a new congregation over there. And he went and he came back, and we said, "We got to do this. The country's open. People want to hear the gospel. We got to take the work. We got to take it there." And so this committee was formed to look into starting a work there in Russia. The problem was we were inexperienced and we didn't know what we were doing. So we used some smarts and we invited an expert in missions from Abilene Christian University to come and speak to us. And he came one weekend and spent Friday to Sunday with us, with the mission committee, giving us classes, talking to us about how to start a work and things we needed to know and things we needed to be aware of and all that. And I remember Sunday after church, I was outside talking to him. He's getting ready to go to the airport and leave. And I remember what he told me. He said this to me: don't do it. He said, you aren't ready. But because you're not ready, you don't know what you're doing, the work is going to fail due to your lack of experience. And he wanted me to take that message back to the congregation. We didn't listen to him. Like Peter, we decided to get out of the boat. You know, to many, Peter seemed like a fool that night he stepped out of the boat. I think the initial reaction by Peter to get out of the boat was a pretty easy decision on his part. He saw Jesus. He had faith, and he wanted to go to him. Look at what he said there in verse 28 of chapter 14. Lord, if it's you, let me come to you on the water. Do you know what Peter's asking to do there? Think about it for a moment. Peter is asking to do the impossible. When was the last time you saw someone walk on water? He's asking Jesus, let me come do something that I know is impossible to do. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. And he got out of the boat. And he took a few steps. And then the reality of his situation set in. He felt the wind and he saw the waves. And look at verse 30. It says, he saw the wind and was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. When I think about Peter doing this, I think about these cartoons. I like cartoons. I'm a big Bugs Bunny fan. But anyway, I think of these cartoons, you know, the cartoon character runs off a cliff in the midair, and he's just kind of standing there in midair. All of a sudden, like, I can't do this. And well, that's how I see Peter at that moment. He gets out of the boat. He takes a few steps, and he realizes, I can't walk on water. Down he goes at that point in time. Reality set in, and he started to sink. You know, Peter, and I feel sorry for Peter. He makes it easy for us to criticize him because he's so impulsive. And usually when we read this story, we miss the part that he did the impossible, and we look at the fact that he sunk. As if we'd do any better, you know? But the reason we criticize him is because he normally acts before he thinks through the consequences. From walking on water, to cutting off poor Malchus's ear, to boasting to Jesus that he would never forsake him. I mean, he blew all those, didn't he? And so we have a tendency to criticize Peter. Let me tell you about Peter. Peter was a man of faith inside a man of weakness. That's who Peter was. See, when Jesus said, come, Peter didn't hesitate. He just jumped out of that boat into the water. He didn't think about the fact that Jesus was calling him to do the impossible. But when he saw the waves and he felt the wind, he lost his focus. That kept him afloat. He took his eyes off Jesus and he sunk. And that prompted Jesus to say this to him in verse 31. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You have little faith, he said. Why did you doubt? I don't think that was a rebuke to Peter as much as it was a challenge to him. Because Peter, there's going to be other moments for you to step out of the boat. And in the future, Don't doubt. That's, I think, what Jesus was telling him. You want to know what I believe that Peter's greatest moment was? It wasn't when he stepped out of the boat. I mean, that was something, wasn't it? That's got to be his second greatest moment. But let me tell you what I think his greatest moment was. It's what happened next after he started to sink. He reached out to Jesus. See, that's our problem. Lots of times we start to sink and we don't reach out to Jesus. But he knew where to look. He knew where to reach out to. And see, that's what saving faith is all about. Salvation is impossible without Jesus. I think about the story of the rich young ruler, the rich young man there in Matthew chapter 19. And this young man comes to Jesus and he's asking, what do I need to do to go to heaven? And basically it came down to his wealth, didn't it? And it says he walked away because he loved his money more than he did Jesus. And Jesus looked at his disciples at that time and says, it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into heaven. You want to know who he was talking about when he said that? Don't be offended. But he was talking about us in the 21st century in America. We are rich. You know, we hear people talk about the 1%ers, the ultra rich in this world. But the truth is, if you own a home, and you own a car, and you're an American citizen, you're in the top 10% of the wealthiest people in the world. 90% of the people in the world are a lot poorer than you are. I never knew how much until I went to Russia. I never understood what poor meant until I went to Russia. And I got an education at that point. And Jesus is looking at us and says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for an American in the 21st century to get into heaven. And that should scare us. You know what scared his disciples? And they looked at him and said, if that's the case, who can be saved? And luckily in verse 26 of Matthew 19, Jesus said this, with man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. Amen. With God, even Americans in the 21st century can be saved. But it won't be through us. It won't be through our efforts. It won't be through our goodness. It won't even be through our wealth. It'll only be through Jesus. Because he's the only place we can look for our salvation. And then Jesus lifted Peter back up out of the water. And Peter and Jesus walked back to the boat together on water. You know, the story of Peter here in chapter 14 is not really about Peter. I think it's really about us. Jesus is calling us, his people, to step out of the boat. To do his will is to do the impossible. He's calling us to get out of our comfort zone. To start doing things maybe we've never done before, never even thought, I can't do that. There was a time in my life I had never taught a class. And I found myself in a situation one time where we needed somebody to teach a class. And I looked around and I was the only one and I said, well, I guess I'll do it. I felt sorry for those guys back then. Okay? I wasn't very good. But you know, lots of times when you start doing something, you find out you have a gift you never knew you had. And it's not because it was internal. I think God gives us the gifts we need. And when we exercise it, we start using it, we really start to see impossible things happen. Who would have guessed someone like me would have gone and preached the gospel in a foreign country like Russia? I never would. But to serve him is to do the impossible because we live in a hostile world that's in denial of him. And this world needs the impossible. Many people thought our decision to go ahead and plant a church in Russia was foolhardy, especially in light of the experts' warning to us. But we saw amazing things happen. And it turned into a very successful work. In fact, the church in Tomsk, Russia that we planted is one of the model churches in Russia today. They just celebrated this past fall their 25th anniversary. They're twice as large as we are. Okay? They have seeded churches, because it's a college town, they have seeded churches across Russia with young men and women who came unbelievers and left believers. And there are Christians from that church all across Russia today serving in other parts. That's what God does when you decide to get out of the boat. And when I decided to go to Russia, there were some, especially my parents, who thought that was equally foolhardy. I hate to think what Denise's parents thought of me. I was rash like Peter. I made the decision to go to Russia. I went from not thinking about it to deciding to go in a 48-hour period. I got a phone call on a Friday night about 10:15. I had sat down to watch a movie I wanted to see for a while, Executive Decision, and my phone rang. I didn't finish the movie. The guy on the other end said, we've got an opportunity for you to go to Russia if you and your family want to go. By the way, I need an answer by Sunday night. That was the call. And we made the decision to go. And for the next 6 years, we lived with that reality of making that decision. And many times, I felt like I was sinking. I was in over my head. I didn't know what I was doing half the time. Like Peter, I was a man of faith inside a man of weakness. And I think most, if not all, men of faith are like that. We're all weak. I think of men of faith like Paul. Paul doesn't talk about it a lot in his writing. He hints about it at times, but there's a couple of times that he just lets his hair down and he says, this is just the way I'm feeling right now. One of those times is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Let's look at that for a moment. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. He tells the Corinthian Christians, he says, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We are under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure. See, he says he's sinking there. Get this, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts, we felt the sentence of death. You ever feel that way? You ever feel like you're in over your head? It's beyond your ability to endure. Ever have those moments where you say, I just wish I could curl up and die? That's what Paul is saying there. But look at what he says next. He tells us there's a purpose for that. There's a purpose for those moments that you start to sink. He says this. But this happened, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Amen. See, that's what happened to Peter that day. He stepped out of the boat. He was doing something that was beyond his abilities. And he started thinking about it. Momentarily, he lost focus on Jesus and he started to sink. And Jesus didn't say this, but I think he felt that, Peter, that's what I wanted. This is the lesson I wanted you to learn. Because he looked back up as he was going down into the water. He looked up and there was Jesus and he reached out to him. And Paul said, that's what happened to me in Asia. I was sinking and I had to reach out for Jesus. And that's what we need to do. When I walked the streets of Tomsk, Russia, I couldn't help but think, who am I? I'm just a kid from Oil Trough, Arkansas. Who am I to do something like that? But see, it wasn't about me. It was about God working through me. It was about me yielding myself to His will and in return, seeing the impossible. Even doing the impossible. And I believe we can do that here. When we yield ourselves to God and we step out of the boat and we start doing things that maybe we've never done before as a church and even as individuals. I think many times God's just waiting to do something and watch me bless you. And a lot of times Christians and churches don't see the impossible because they don't step out in faith. They don't get out of the boat. Do you know what Peter did that day? He walked on water. You kind of hear somebody say that, yeah, he got scared and sunk. Yes, but he still walked on water. How many of the other disciples could make that boast? I can hear him now. See that Peter sunk? You know, they didn't do that. Peter got out of the boat and walked on water and their jaws dropped open. That's what none of them could ever make that boast. Only Peter did. Jesus told him to come, and he went, and he experienced something marvelous, even though he may have momentarily stumbled. But he learned to reach out and to trust in Jesus. And I think that's the point of this story, more than anything else. Today, Jesus calls us to come to him and to follow him. And when we do, we will see amazing and marvelous things. We too, like Peter, may stumble. But Jesus has promised that he will be right there with us the whole time. An aged Christian once told me this. When we do what God tells us to do, I believe we will see amazing things happen. Are you willing today to get out of the boat and do the impossible? Jesus is calling us all to come and follow him. And you may not walk on water. And you may not go to a foreign land. But Jesus wants to work through you right here where you live today. Here in Henderson, Las Vegas, whatever community you live in. God wants to help you do the impossible. To do that, though, you have to answer the call to Jesus. That's the first step. That's the first step to getting out of the boat. And if you've not done that, if you've never become a Christian, if you've been studying his word, you've come to that point. I need to come to Jesus. I need to repent of my sins. I need to have my sins forgiven in the waters of baptism. Let me tell you, today's the day to do that. Today's the day to take the first step in getting out of the boat. And don't be afraid. Jesus will be there every step of the way. And you may not have another opportunity like today. Maybe you've answered that call, but you've allowed some sin into your life that is holding you back. Maybe it's the sin of complacency or laziness. That's something that we all struggle with. Whatever the sin is, today's a good day to deal with that too, to come forward, repent, and ask for prayers through the congregation. I tell you what, you got a family here who loves you and wants the best for you. Or maybe you have some other need that you need to deal with that you want to bring towards the congregation. We invite you today, whatever your need is, please come while we stand and sing.